Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Dave, there's the former mayor of, I think, South Bend, Indiana.
Right.
Pete Buttigieg. I always bumble that name. And of course, he was a presidential candidate. Now he's part of the Biden administration. He had a kind of an interesting interview recently. He was put on the hot spot by none other than Charlemagne the God.
Spelled T-H-A.
I'm not sure how to pronounce that.
Yeah, Charlemagne the God. So a little background for those who need the reminder. Charlemagne the God he's a fairly well-established Black radio host, syndicated radio host.
Okay.
And he has a TV show series on Comedy Central that's not a weekly thing. They do it seasonally. So he does a certain number and then they take some time off and he comes back for another season and that kind of stuff. It's kind of a black male version of Samantha Bee.
Okay.
For those who know her on TBS. Another one
Samantha
I can't
Bee,
stand.
the one that held up the bloody head?
No, that was Kathy Griffin.
I'm so bad with these things.
They're all.
I get them mixed up.
Samantha Bee drives you crazy. Her promos, I see a lot of things. There's a lot of sports on TBS.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I end up watching, especially during March Madness. We just got through basketball. We actually didn't get to talk about this last week because we had to record the podcast a day early. But congratulations to the Kansas Jayhawks.
Yeah. How about that?
Your friend Christian Brown.
Yeah.
And his father Donnie
had a pretty incredible second half. I mean, that was not merely did KU win the national championship, they did so in a way that's never been done before. They were down by 15 points at the halftime break. No team has ever come back in a championship game from a deficit like that to win. So it was pretty awesome to watch.
They were definitely the better team.
Yeah.
So it was congrats to them. And then the Masters was this past weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Great showing by Scheffler, Scott Scheffler, who won the Masters, went start to finish. Was the leader going into the clubhouse the end of day Thursday and never relinquished the lead.
Yeah.
But through both of those events, a lot of them were on TBS.
Mm-hmm.
And these are two things that I love watching. Right. And so I'm watching all these and you see these constant ads for Samantha Bee. and the latest, I can't decide if I want to be angry or if I just need to laugh at the absurdity of the assertions that they make and that millions of Americans buy into.
Yeah.
Samantha Bee's latest thing is a campaign against banning books. But she says it's the Republicans wanting to ban children's books in schools. It's not the Democrats, which we know it's the Democrats who have been trying to ban books for the last few decades.
Right.
And she even brings in Dr. Seuss and says it's the Republicans banning books. And I guarantee there are millions of people out there saying that they're listening to her.
Yeah.
So Charlemagne the God, bringing back to this, he's sort of like a Samantha Bee. He's got a radio show called.
By the way, I just want to say one thing about the whole banning books thing. We have become so soft in the modern world. We don't really know what it is to ban books. Now, in the medieval world, they knew what it meant to ban. When they banned books, they gathered them all up forcefully, burned them right out in the town square so everyone could. And if you got caught with one of them, you were either going to prison or worse. You might have your head cut off or something like that. That's book banning. Today, what we call book banning, it's usually a school or an organization making a choice about what books they're going to include in their curriculum and which books they're not going to include. And if the book is somehow controversial, someone says, "Oh, they're banning that book." No. Let's be real clear. Anyone in America is perfectly free, 100% free to read any book they want to read. It's just some groups and some organizations, some schools make choices that they're going to study this book and not some other book.
Well, that's true to an extent, but let's also not forget when they do this in schools, school libraries are the place where most young people find access to to different books they want to read. And when they ban them, they also remove them from the library. But that is still not on the level. And you go back to the medieval times. We don't have to go back that far. Just go to progressive socialist Nazi Germany.
Oh,
they were burning books in the town square as Adolf Hitler stood and watched it with a grin on his face.
And literally, you couldn't find the banned books. And if you did, you didn't want to get caught with it,
right?
Because something really bad was going to happen to you,
right?
If some school district today bans, Dr. Seuss because they refer to a man and a woman or something like that, right? You can still get that Dr. Seuss book. You can order it from Amazon. You can read it. Nobody's going to arrest you, and then no one's going to cut your hands or feet off or any terrible torturous thing. So we've just become.
Yes.
We've become this whole banning book things is exaggerated.
I'm with you.
It's
like
what agree. The Weather Channel does. When a little snowstorm is coming, every snowstorm is Armageddon, right? It's like the end of the world because that's how you get ratings, you get clicks, you get people paying attention.
We are going down so many tangents right now, but I have to share this. Have you been following any of the Elon Musk buying his way into Twitter? We talked about it a little bit last week.
Yeah, a little bit. I have seen some prominent people out there wringing their hands with great concern that Musk pushing for freedom on Twitter, free speech, is going to mean unfree speech.
Right.
I mean, it literally we're in what's the famous novel Alice in Wonderland?
Yes.
Where, words mean the opposite of what they're supposed to mean. It's Orwellian doublespeak.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. This is more and more turning into 1984
right.
Or Animal Farm than we've ever thought about. The thing I was going to bring up, well, first of all, Elon Musk just over the weekend ended up turning down the board seat that was originally offered to him. And they had negotiated that he was going to join the board of Twitter, and everybody was making jokes about what the first board meeting with Elon Musk was going to be like. Then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he says, you know what, I've decided it's for the best that I don't. The belief is there is a max, there's a cap put on board members of how much of the company you're allowed to own. It's just over 14%.
Yeah.
And
he might keep gobbling up
there's
more.
a belief that he wants to gobble up more than that, eventually maybe own 51% of Twitter.
Yeah. And
if that's the case, he doesn't want to be on the board. So he has stepped away from the board, and now he's posting all kinds of things. And one of them that was really interesting, as you were talking about the Weather Channel, this triggered it. He posted this chart that was a big survey of Democrats and Republicans, and then found the averages of how much people trusted different media outlets.
Okay.
Republicans even don't trust the Weather Channel. and
I don't trust the Weather Channel.
Right. And I don't either. And I'm going down this list or I'm going through the comments, and the comments were, you have all the leftists who are, see, this is how crazy Republicans are.
Right.
They don't even trust the Weather Channel. How are we supposed to ever have a rational conversation with these people when they don't even trust what the Weather Channel is telling them? And then all of a sudden you see the comments following that of every snowstorm, like you said, is Armageddon, but even worse, the videos of the Weather Channel guys holding the umbrellas, trying not to get blown away.
Yes.
And then you just see some guy walk across the background. And I'm just sitting there thinking, that's why we don't trust anything in the media anymore. This is not about trying to provide us the news. This is not about trying to provide us anything of value. They're just trying to scare us into the world is coming to an end. And
I've seen another one of those Weather Channel videos where the reporter out there in the midst of a storm, he's trying to demonstrate how terrible the flooding is. And there was some flooding, but he's standing there in water like up to his waist, and the camera sort of pans back and you can see everything. He's in a ditch. He's in a, it's like, come on, this is just theatrics.
Right. Right. So you said with the Weather Channel, and Elon Musk made this whole big deal on Twitter about, it's about time we start realizing that you can't trust anything.
Right.
And that's one of his goals with Twitter, is to make it somewhat trustworthy again. I don't know how that's ever going to be possible. I watch too many people talking on there.
I mean, in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he wants to make Twitter trustworthy by doing nothing. That is, by letting people just speak.
Yeah.
And saying, you judge for yourself who you want to believe or whether you want to believe, but let people speak and argue and debate and throw out opinions, whether they're ridiculous or intelligent, whatever, actually speaking freely.
We're just so far gone, it seems like sometimes, when Samantha Bee can literally sit there on television. The people are paying her to get on television and say Republicans are banning Dr. Seuss.
Yeah.
After we just spent 2 years just talking about this nonstop.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, well, if she says it, it must be true. It gets to me. Back to Charlemagne the God.
Yeah, Charlemagne the God.
So Charlemagne the God has 2 shows. One is on Comedy Central called The God's Honest Truth.
Okay.
With Charlemagne the God.
Okay.
Which The God's Honest Truth by a progressive, by a nihilist, Marxist progressive.
Right.
Who doesn't believe in truth. It's kind of an ironic title.
Sure.
So there's that whole conversation. But then he has a weekly or a daily radio show called The Breakfast Club.
That I've heard of. I didn't miss that because it's one of my favorite movies from the 80s.
Mine too. And I'm
kind of Molly Ringwald movie.
Kind of disappointed he stole it.
Yeah.
So Charlemagne the God has this show on, or he has his radio show, and he broadcasts the video. And I'm going to actually ask, let's show that video first, and let's take a minute and show that video. So people can actually see what this conversation was.
You do realize, Pete, a lot of black people feel like Democrats have kept no promises since they've been in office.
Really?
Yes. Reverend Island said that a million times. I'm sure he'll be pressing you about that tomorrow.
Look, I get it, because the work is not done. But the reason I say really is we just passed one of the biggest pieces of infrastructure legislation in American history. It was a promise, and it wasn't just a promise that the Biden-Harris administration made or that us Democrats made in 2020. This is a promise that every president and every Congress has made in some way, shape, or form for as long as I've been an adult. And we actually did it.
But those are big, broad things. And that's great. But I'm talking about things you campaigned on, like the George Floyd Policing Act. And the fact that our voting rights, man, like 19 states have implemented voter suppression bills. You know that's going to directly impact us the most. And the only strategy Democrats are going to have is we got to go out there and vote in mass numbers to fight it. That's not a strategy. No, Hope is not a strategy.
So in the video, we see Charlemagne the God saying to Pete Buttigieg, you haven't followed through on one promise that you've made.
Meaning you Democrats,
right?
Not just you, Pete.
And he calls
you Democrats,
and he calls the Democrats out on this. He says Democrats have been promising the black community all of these things, and you haven't followed through on any of them. Now, the things he calls out, I take issue with as it is. He talks about voter suppression laws that I don't believe are voter suppression laws.
Right.
He talks about the George Floyd police bills and things like that, which there's probably a conversation to be had there. We've been having that for a while, but the path that the Democrats are advocating for is certainly not right.
Yeah.
And at the same time,
I just want to be real clear, because I've asked. I'm very frank in my interaction with people. I've asked numerous black friends of mine, are you suppressed, oppressed, in any way harmed if there's a law that says all citizens have to show an ID to vote? Does that oppress you? And I've yet to hear one say yes. Everyone I've spoken to, including my friends with black skin, they say that makes sense. I got to show IDs for all kinds of other things. When I go to the airport, when I go buy a 6-pack of beer at the liquor store, all kinds of things I have to show an ID. So yeah.
And in the last 2 years, they've started making people get COVID vaccines and have vaccine cards. And if you can get one of those, why can't you get an ID?
Yep, that's right.
And the only difference is there's a higher cost for an ID than there is a vaccine card, and that cost is paid to the government. So at some point we have to think about, is the problem getting the ID, or is the problem the government causing waits and causing problems and having tough hours, and is the government making it harder to get IDs rather than the fact that they think
Dave, what are you saying?
Can't.
That government's not efficient? as a provider of services and products, it's not efficient.
It is certainly not what they would teach in business school as the picture of efficiency. So he has Buttigieg on, and he's saying, you Democrats, you haven't followed through on any of this. And Buttigieg first responds, really? Like he's surprised to hear this.
He can't believe he's actually being asked this question.
Well, I think he actually believes that they have been following through. And when he says, I think we've delivered this infrastructure project.
Yeah.
And I'm just sitting there thinking, wait a minute, like you've delivered an infrastructure project, but we have supply chain problems all over the country.
Yep.
You've had inflation rates go up to 8.5%.
Yeah.
As of this week, we are skyrocketing on all of these things. Supermarket shelves have been bare. Product shelves have been bare. You and I were just talking. You need some work done in your car, and there's no supplies and there's no mechanics.
Yeah.
We have all of these problems, and those are all infrastructure related. And Pete Buttigieg is literally sitting there saying, "Hey, we've delivered infrastructure for you."
Right.
And it just blew my mind that is the response, and he believes it sincerely.
You know, and this is probably something for a bigger conversation at another time. When you drill down into the reality that many Americans with black skin, what they live, you very quickly see fundamental problems that have nothing to do with, Biden's infrastructure program. Right. Things like incredibly high rates of children being born without ever knowing their fathers. That alone correlates with all kinds of problems, including increased rates of incarceration. You're more likely to go to jail, poor performance in school. I mean, all kinds of things. And yet that problem has been chronic among black Americans now for 3 decades. And what Democrats have done is they've actually created programs to incentivize more of that and make those problems worse. And then if you go to, it's no secret, there are large cities, urban areas that are run by Democrats that have large black populations. Go to one of those cities and try to start a business.
Yep.
See what happens. You're going to run into one regulatory obstacle after another, after another, after another. The progressive administrative state has made it almost impossible. If you're a poor man, a poor woman, living in New York City, living in Los Angeles, living in Detroit, in Oakland, in Baltimore, we could go through all these cities, right? Yeah. You're a poor black person there, and you have some talent, some skill. You can do something. You want to try to start a business. What they've done is they've made it almost impossible. And they've also, at the same time, they've made it impossible to start a business. They've restricted construction of new homes. So the supply of housing is low, which means housing prices go up. And of course, what the Democrats offer as solutions to all these problems are subsidies. Well, we'll give you money to help you pay for housing. We'll subsidize you with some kind of welfare since you don't have a job, you can't start a business. When all these problems are artificial, they're all government created problems that don't have to exist.
Do you remember the football coach Tony Dungy?
Yeah.
Tony Dungy was a coach with the Colts and Tampa at different points in time, won a Super Bowl.
He's still he's a commentator.
Still a commentator.
Yeah.
But he is also very, very active in communities, in black communities. Tony Dungy was a black head football coach in the NFL, extremely successful, extremely respected among everybody who is around the NFL. And Tony Dungy was getting destroyed on Twitter this weekend because on Friday or maybe Saturday, I don't remember the exact day, Tony Dungy met with and appeared with Ron DeSantis to sign a bill to help young black Americans in Florida who want to start businesses and who are looking for opportunities. And Tony Dungy was doing something with him to help raise money for an organization that he runs that provides mentorship both in business and life to young black Americans who grew up without fathers in the home.
Yep.
And he was talking about this epidemic of fatherless homes within the black community. And DeSantis and Dungy got together and said, we're going to do something about this. And Dungy was coming to it with a private business, a private market solution that DeSantis said, this is really great. And I want to direct people to this and I want to celebrate this. And just the mere fact of appearing with Ron DeSantis,
who's a Republican.
There's
the problem.
And
there's the problem.
And somebody who is friends with Donald Trump,
Yep.
the Twitterverse went berserk.
Yeah.
And they couldn't believe it. And then they started accusing Dungy of lying. And they can't just say, I can't believe he would partner with Ron DeSantis.
Right.
He starts saying they started posting repeatedly. I mean, millions of posts. It was trending.
Yeah.
There's no epidemic of single parent households in the Black community. The stats that Tony Dungy read are lies. He's making them up. There's no way it could be that high. This is not true. You just want to hold Black people back.
Right.
And this is Tony Dungy, whose entire program is to help mentor young Black Americans.
Well, and I mean, there's a couple of just huge things there. One, it shows how complete the partisanship has become in the United States. Just complete, total. I mean, everything is partisan. So anything that might in any way help a Republican, if you're a liberal Democrat, you have to crush it. You have to smash it. You have to discredit it. Even if it's a good guy like Tony Dungy trying to do something really, really good for poor Black kids in America.
Right.
You have to smash it and discredit it anyway, because you cannot allow someone of a different political party, the opposing political party, in any way receive any kind of credit for anything good. In terms of the statistics, this is one of these things that even in the social sciences, among criminologists, for example, people who study crime, they have been liberal, conservative, doesn't matter. Across the board, criminologists have agreed for decades. One of the biggest variables in determining whether young people are going to, how likely they are to end up in jail or committing violent crimes and things like this is fatherlessness.
Yeah.
And then when they start breaking it down by demographic groups, Black Americans are way up there at the top. And it's, it's amazing to me, Dave, you and I have this project. I mean, it's part of our bigger work at the Vino and Veritas Society. One of our goals is to teach Americans today of all the harm that has been caused by progressivism, by progressive ideas, by progressive policies, by progressive incentives, by progressive culture. It hurts people in all kinds of ways, directly, indirectly. And what you're describing here taking place on the out there on the internet this weekend is just more evidence of why our message is so badly needed.
Right.
There are millions and millions of Americans deeply confused who actually think progressivism has somehow helped. And if there are any problems remaining, the solution must be more progressivism, when the truth is 180 degrees the opposite. Many of these problems have been caused by progressivism, and the more subsidies, the more preferential treatment programs, all the more tribalism, all those things, the worse that these problems are going to get.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I got the opportunity last night to sit in on one of our chapter meetings. It was our chapter in Central Denver, chapter number 1, and they really dug into the case study this month. A lot of them listened to last week's podcast. They all had gone through the document, and it was a really fascinating discussion. And that chapter's ability to bring this back to progressive causes was really fascinating, and I loved to hear how this went. And I think one of the very first things that we talked about that was discussed at this meeting was something that hasn't been discussed enough. And that is, you and I have talked in the past about how once a progressive program gets started, once a bureaucratic program gets started, there's no getting rid of it.
Never goes away.
In any form or fashion, right?
In fact, I'm going to put this out there. This might be one of the most important pivotal changes that could happen in our politics. Our politics right now today, and for many decades it's been this way, is a politics of more programs, more policy, more plans. But and often this cuts across party lines. Many Republicans talk this way too. If you elect me, I have this plan for our schools. I have a plan for, to save Social Security. I have a plan for this, a plan for that. I have a plan to save the earth from global climate change. And it's always more. There is no politics today. There is no politics of analyzing everything we've created in the past, and we're still funding, and it's still going on, and judging the results. Are these things actually doing what? And if they're not, we should scale them back or abolish them and get rid of them. There is no politics about cutting back. And that would probably be one of the biggest pivotal, that would be a sea change in America if we could actually start talking publicly and politically about scaling back, abolishing, restricting everything that we've created.
If I could control every single Republican's campaign for this coming November and for 2024, I would advocate for every single one of them to run a campaign of, we're going to pass a law, pass a bill through Congress that says that every single government program has a mandated sunset clause on it. It's a certain number of years maximum can exist, and it can never be made permanent. I don't care if it's a tax increase or a tax cut. I don't care if it's a military function or not. I don't care if it's transportation or healthcare or anything else. Every single government program should have a sunset clause on it, and it should be redebated. And if they want to bring it back at the end of that, then bring it back, but have to discuss it again and make that next Congress, make that next Senate have to sit there and say, okay, here's the successes, here's the failures. They're all failures, by the way.
Think of, I'm going to connect this. You and I have been having this very rich, wonderful conversation about sports the last few weeks. And you have really thought through, you've made some comments about the difference between games that are timed and games that are not timed. And everything that it means when you put a clock, you attach a clock to a game. It changes everything because now all of a sudden there's a clock running when the time runs out. Right, that's it.
Pressure.
There's pressure. And imagine if we started treating government programs the same way. Put a clock on it. There is, at some point, the clock runs out of time, and that's it. So whatever you want to achieve, whatever success or victory means for a program or an agency, you have, X amount of months or years or whatever the time is, you have that time to go achieve it.
Yep. So all of that said, we were talking last night about government programs, and you and I have talked about how these bureaucratic programs, they never go away. Once you establish a bureaucracy, their budget always increases. They give themselves pay increases. They go to court and they tell the courts, here's how you should judge us, and here's how you should evaluate this. It's gotten completely out of control.
They also know very well they will fail, sometimes purposefully fail, in achieving their goals so that they can go sit in Congress the next week and say, we're really sorry we failed. If we just had more money, we could do a better job. And that's how they get pay increases.
Well, and I'm going to make an argument that is fairly controversial. I'm going to argue right now that is happening in our military engagements as we speak.
Yeah.
There are people purposely failing. There are people purposely saying, we need to keep these programs in place because we complain that they don't have a set goal in mind. They don't know what a win looks like. This goes back to Cotavilla's essay, and this is the case study for the month. He says you should always go in with what does a win look like and how do you accomplish it?
We should remind, if we have listeners who didn't hear last week's podcast, we do a case study every month. For those who have not yet checked it out, we produce a case study. You can get a lot from the case studies on your own if you want. They're also great conversation starters for those who form chapters. Yep. And as you're describing that chapter meeting last night, the chapters really can be a wonderful experience for those who are serious about their chapters. If you really want to take the time and make your chapter a good chapter, right, and communicate with chapter members, we have seen some wonderful socializing and learning events happening within our chapters. And the case study this month is a short essay from a very unusual kind of thinker in the realm of international relations and foreign policy. His name's Angelo Codevilla. And it turns out this little essay is sparking some incredible discussions at our chapter meetings.
And what you're going to find in these chapter meetings, before we get back to the topic, what you're going to find in these chapter meetings is you're going to learn about different things that people have learned about in the past. You're going to learn about people's history and people's experience and education that you had no idea. And people are going to be able to bring some very, very fascinating thoughts to the table that you don't even know these people are out there. I mean, last night, literally sitting around this table, we had multiple military veterans.
Mm-hmm.
One is a graduate of West Point.
Mm-hmm.
One was a Russian history major in college. I mean, we have these guys and these guys and men and women that have these phenomenal backgrounds that can add so much to the conversation.
Right.
And there's so much to learn from one another. So this conversation last night went to government programs that never end. And one of them that we brought up was NATO. NATO was created at the very beginning as the response to the Soviet Union.
Right.
We're going to create this block of countries that is going to be there to stand up to the Soviet Union. If that's the case,
there was no need, right? There was no need to have NATO if there was no Soviet Union.
Right. So why 30? How many years later? I mean,
right.
what year did the wall come down? And I mean, we're talking 30, almost 40 years later, 35
right.
years later.
Right.
We still have NATO, and it's talking about expansion.
Right.
And Putin is sitting there, and I'm not condoning anything that Putin has done.
Yep.
Putin is an awful, atrocious person who is attacking and murdering people and
right.
advocating for rape and doesn't believe in private property. And he is a brutal dictator. And I totally understand that. I'm not advocating for anything that he's done. At the same time, who can blame him for feeling threatened when an organization that was supposed to be created to combat the Soviet Union, the
right.
Soviet Union falls, and for 35 years, it's continued to exist and expand closer and closer to his border and exercise, do military exercises within 50 miles of the
mm-hmm.
border of Russia. And he's supposed to say, okay, I'm just supposed to be terrified and sit back and do nothing. We're not helping our cause here. And I think that's mostly Codevilla's argument.
Yeah, I mean, it raises this question, right? In the absence of the Soviet Union, once the Soviet Union crumbles and is dissolved, what is the purpose of NATO? Is its purpose to be anti-Russia?
Right.
Is that its purpose? And if not, what exactly is? I mean, if you could try to put yourself, sitting there in the Kremlin in Moscow, and you're thinking about Russian things, the interests of Russia, how would you think about NATO? Would you look at NATO as a potential friendly set of nations and allies? Would you view it as a growing threat? How exactly would you grow it or view it? And it does go to this point that government institutions, organizations really have one purpose, and that is to perpetuate themselves.
Right.
That's their real purpose, to perpetuate their own existence, to get more resources, more power, more control, and go on forever.
And just like every other government program,
mm-hmm.
NATO has been one of those that has continued to just grow and grow and grow and grow. And then we went back to the same conversation of okay, so you have NATO out there. And one of the points in time that NATO really grew post-Soviet Russia, post-USSR, was under Bill Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
It was in the mid-90s when we really saw this sort of explosion of NATO power and NATO growth, because there was nothing pushing back against it.
Right.
And
that included a number of small countries that formerly were part of the Soviet Union.
Right.
Now they're independent states. And so they're making alliances with NATO.
Right. And along those lines, let's not forget how many bureaucrats are lining their pockets
Sure.
through the military industrial complex and the the service providers and the ammunition providers and all of these things who are selling all of this to everybody. And we're building up our military, and we're building up NATO, and not only America, but other countries are expanding all of this. And the military industrial complex grew to huge sizes with no pushback opposite NATO. It could just keep expanding, which is really where we saw the launch and growth of the Clinton Foundation, right? This is where the Clinton Foundation really started to take shape and take hold around the world. So we're talking about all of this, and all of a sudden the conversation came up of, I just suggested we should have sunset clauses on all of these bureaucratic programs.
Right.
At what point do we start telling our government that you can't go engage? We're not going to allow you. We give you authority. We give you power. You don't tell us who makes the rule. You don't make the rules on us.
Right.
We make the rules.
Right.
Should we be restricting the power of our government to make alliances, make treaties, to engage in things like that? Going all the way back to 93, when Bill Clinton had a complete Democrat Congress and was sitting in the White House, and goes to Ukraine and says, hey, okay, now you got to give up all your nuclear arsenal, and we're going to protect you. He was making a promise for American presidents perpetually into the future that we had no idea if we were going to be able to fulfill.
Right. Well, when a president acts, in a unilateral way like that, it certainly raises a big question with whatever parties he is making an agreement with. What does that agreement actually mean? What does it mean? Here's the key question. What does it mean when that president is no longer president? Is that agreement still somehow binding? The Constitution has something to say about this. Now this is a question, we talk a lot at the Vino and Veritas Society about prudence. And this is a great example of a prudential question. There is no clearly obvious perfect answer or solution to this. If the government of the United States is going to get involved in any kind of long-term enduring commitment, obligation, agreement, prudence suggests, that should require more than just one person, like a president.
Correct.
So what the Constitution says is, for a treaty, for an agreement to rise to the level of a treaty, it requires the consent of the Senate. So usually it's a president will broker some basic terms with a foreign nation or a group of foreign nations, but then that has to come back and be approved by the United States Senate. One of the most famous episodes when that failed was Woodrow Wilson's effort to get the United States into what was then called the League of Nations in the 19-teens. This is a forerunner. This is before the UN had been created. And he was feeling quite victorious returning home from Europe because he had lined up everything. Everything seemed great. And then his own Senate refused to confirm this treaty. So we never entered the League of Nations. And then, of course, and you and I have talked about this offline a little bit, when the designers of the architects of the Constitution said, okay, we want the Senate to be that voice of that additional voice of reason and reflection, not because all the senators are going to be, brilliant or wise, but those senators have a very unique kind of political allegiance. Their allegiance, they take an oath to the Constitution, but who they're really accountable is to their own state legislators under the original design of the Constitution. And so the senators are always thinking about what is good for their state, what is good for their state government, what's good for the people in their state, what power should the federal government exercise, even in the name of a treaty, of fulfilling treaty obligations. What power is rightfully the power of the federal government versus what power should be exercised at the state or even local municipal levels. Senators are keenly aware of that because when they were the senators under the original Constitution, this is before the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913, senators are always thinking whatever they do, when it's time for re-election, they would have to go back to their state legislature. And the state legislature is filled with state legislators, who tend to be really jealous of their own power. They don't want the federal government coming in and doing things that the state is supposed to do. Now, the 17th Amendment changes the composition of the Senate. It changes how senators are elected. We adopt popular elections. So now someone elected to the Senate has no allegiance to, no obligation to the state government. There's no reason not to trample all over the state, to vote for federal programs that do things that the state's supposed to do. Really, the only thing that matters is come election time every 6 years, throw some kind of bones, some kind of perks,
right.
So usually in the form of some kind of grant or money going back to your state. And then you show up for a few campaign rallies and say, look at all the federal money I just helped channel to the people of this good state,
right.
And you get reelected over and over and over. And in all that transformation of the Senate, one thing no one talked about, well, should the powers of the Senate be changed then? If we're going to change the composition of the Senate, should we change those powers, such as the treaty-making power?
Well, and there's also a question of should the powers of the states be changed when that happened. And I want to come back to that in a second, but there are really, well, let's talk about that first. It says in the Constitution, correct me if I'm wrong, it says in the Constitution that no state shall make a treaty with a foreign nation. Correct?
Yes.
So the states are sitting there saying, if Texas wanted to make an agreement with Mexico about border security, right? If the state of Texas is concerned about the cartels sending drugs and sending other gang members and things like that across the border illegally,
all of which result from the war on drugs,
right?
But,
right.
Go ahead.
But if Texas said, you know what, we need to do something about this. They're all coming across our border.
Yeah.
They're infecting our society, our cities, and we want to do something about that. There is no power. The state is, as a state, they are not allowed to go make an agreement with Mexico.
Right.
So they are then having to turn to the U.S. federal government to do that.
Right.
And the federal government, the people in New York, the people in Northern California, the people in wherever, Chicago, they're not facing the same problems that Texas is facing with this.
Right.
And the bigger problem has become, and I've made this argument for a while, politics used to be very local. Politics was, you'd watch your local news at night. That's where you'd get your information. You'd read your local newspaper. You'd watch your local news, and you would vote for people based on what you were seeing locally. And if you're a news station, you wanted the best guest you could get on. The local news isn't getting the president of the United States to come sit down for an interview with you. So instead, they're getting the mayor, the governor, the local legislators, and that's who you're getting to know, and that's who you care about. That's who you know you can control, and you also know your legislators are the ones putting the senators in the federal government.
It's also the case, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the president of the United States wasn't doing much.
Right.
He didn't have much to do. Most of the things going on in your town, in your county, in your state that were directly impacting your life, the president wasn't involved in those things. And so it really didn't make much sense to have even if a local station could get the president on, the president couldn't really talk about any of the subjects that mattered most to the people in a community. The people who are impacting these local subjects are mayors, city and county council members, commissioners, people like that, state legislators, governors.
So as the bureaucracy in D.C. has grown to millions,
yes,
and as cable news has become our focus, right? I think a lot of people know I used to work for a company that owns newspapers all over the world. One of my old employers. In Europe, I think they own just about every major newspaper throughout Europe at this point. And they left the United States. They downsized the United States business because they got frustrated that nobody here wanted to read a newspaper anymore.
Right.
Nobody here was interested in the local politics and the local news. We started this transformation with cable news to, well, I could get to see the president every night. I could see what the biggest names with Dr. Fauci, the biggest bureaucrats and the most powerful bureaucrats who can actually control my life. I get to see them every night. And we've seen this flip of politics being a very local type of institution to, we look at it more top down today. The average American citizen is looking at and I know we're going to have a lot of people listening to this who are really going to not like me saying that, because we have a lot of people who take a lot of time to get involved in local politics here.
Right.
But your average voter, your average American is not paying attention to who's on the primary ballot for state legislature in this state or any other. They're talking about who should be running for president in 2024 already. We are 2.5 years away.
And there are all kinds of problems with that transformation you're describing. One of them is, there's an old cliche, has a lot of truth to it. An expert is someone who lives more than 100 miles away, right? Bring in someone to any event, meeting, whatever it is. If he's not local, that person has kind of an air of authority and expertise.
Sure.
Just because he's an unknown face, right?
Sure.
And translate that now to the kind of transformation you're talking about. I suspect strongly that millions of Americans view local politicians, the mayor, candidates for city council, even state legislators, as kind of low. Low on the intelligence scale, low on the virtue scale, not very impressive, not very interesting. But if they work for the government in Washington, D.C., far away, they have this kind of air of, right? I think Americans tend to put them up on a pedestal. Well, Anthony Fauci works for the, who is this employer? Is it Health and Human Services ultimately? The point is, if you work for a federal agency or something like that, you must be really smart, right? You're genius level up there, and that prejudice, and that is a prejudice. There's no truth to it. It's a prejudice. That's fuel for the progressive administrative state.
Sure.
The progressive administrative state feeds on that kind of prejudice out there in America, that Washington, D.C. is where the really smart expert people go. And your local government, they're kind of local yahoos. They're not very bright. So we don't want them dealing with many subjects.
Right. So you have these senators who are now directly elected by the people rather than by the state legislatures. It's diminished the value and the importance of the state legislature quite a bit, right? I mean, that was a huge deal that they were getting. I would be so much more concerned about who my state legislators were,
right,
if I knew they were choosing our senators,
right,
because those senators were the ones who were approving all of the bureaucrats, right. So if they're approving all of the bureaucrats, and the bureaucrats are the ones who are basically deciding in the Pentagon, are we going to war, right? I mean, the senators just approve whatever the bureaucrats say,
right?
So are we going to war? Are we going to send military? We had a guy in the chapter last night. Like I said earlier, he went to West Point. He served all over the world. And he said friends of his from school have been murdered all over the world for 30 years simply because our government has no plan, has no idea of what a win looks like, and they just want to send people in and keep us fighting in perpetual wars.
The Department of Defense, and this is a tricky thing, Dave. You and I, we've talked about this before, and it's worth mentioning again. When we talk about things related to the military, there is, in my mind, there's a pretty bright line that distinguishes actual servicemen and women. These are the people who are on the ground doing the fighting, boots on the ground, or they're flying the airplanes, or they're on the ships in the Navy, versus the bureaucrats who are sitting in the Pentagon. Those are not servicemen and women. Those are lifelong bureaucrats, most of them. And in the Department of Defense, they literally they have maps of the world, and they divide the world into these zones, and then they keep track of how many of the zones have. There's all these technical terms. They use these hot regions of where there's military conflict going on, where places where we are involved in some either overt or covert, military operations. And from the point of view of those bureaucrats in the Pentagon, the more hot spots there are, the more job security those bureaucrats have.
Sure.
Because they can say, we have troops, in 100 different locations scattered around the world, all these conflicts going on. We need to be monitoring these things and making sure that they get the resources that they need, right? And the logistical support and everything else. And so it's in the interests of a bureaucrat for wars and other kinds of military conflicts to drag on forever. Whereas the boots on the actual military men and women, they either don't want to go at all,
right?
Or if they have to go because the security of the United States is at risk, well, then they want to go and they want to win as quickly as possible and come back home because they want to see their families. They don't want to go fight in. I've never met a military person who wants to be far away fighting an endless war.
Right. Never. I mean,
never.
You don't hear that at all. I mean, and it's even not even an endless war. Even when it's not an endless war, when there's a purpose, go back and talk to people. I mean, it's harder now, but I remember conversations with people who fought in World War II. I mean, I look at the letters that my grandfather sent home. He didn't want to be there. He didn't want to be there fighting. He wanted to be home with my grandmother.
Right.
And it's not in anybody's interest to actually be out there fighting unless you're a bureaucrat sitting in a comfy seat in Washington or in Virginia and being able to say, hey, at least I'm safe. So I'm going to sit here and just put these other people in harm.
And now couple that incentive we're talking about. And that incentive really is true. I mean, that's true for all bureaucrats. That's not just military. That's not only in the Defense Department. Go look at bureaucrats working in the EPA or the FDA or the Department of Transportation, right? Or on and on. Look at all the bureaucrats who have tried to implement programs and policies in health and human services, and what their interests are having more people. There's an old British slogan that used to be popular in the United States in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, being on the dole.
Mm-hmm.
On the dole meant you were getting aid. Someone else was paying for your rent or your food or both. And if you're a bureaucrat managing these programs, your incentive is to have more people on the dole, because then you have more responsibility. You can go demand a pay raise.
Yep.
If there are fewer people on the dole or nobody on the dole, all of a sudden you as the manager of a program, you don't have much to do. By the way, occasionally we mention books in Plato's Cave, and it reminds me of a very important book. A social scientist who used to be kind of obscure and unknown. His name is Charles Murray.
Mm-hmm.
And then he wrote a book titled The Bell Curve, and that caused all kinds of now I've known Charles for 30 years. He's this very quiet. He's a physically small. He's not a large person.
Sure.
He's not a loud person. He's very quiet, very humble. He's a statistician. He loves looking. His dream is looking into databases and then seeing what the data reveals. And now when he shows up at college campuses, they riot and burn buildings down, right? And all because this quiet little social scientist looks at data. Well, among those data, he wrote in one of his first books is titled Losing Ground. And it was a study of government social programs from 1950 to 1980 during a 30-year window. And he had a special interest in that he was in health and human services overseeing the implementation. In many cases, he was on the lines, like working with social workers who were working with families receiving aid and in bad situations. So he was seeing with his own eyes how these things were being implemented. And he describes both, the incentives created by the bureaucrats as well as the incentives that the programs provide. One of the most, he has a lengthy discussion in there of the old program Aid to Families with Dependent Children that emerges after World War II. You just mentioned the war. Many American men died over there. And so as a result, there were instantly there were large numbers of single mothers. Their husbands went and fought in the war and died and never came back.
Mm-hmm.
And the question was, how is a single mom going to raise her kids up to the point where they can be productive adults? So the government creates aid to families with dependent children. The whole idea being it's going to be this bridge. It's going to help a mom with little kids, help her for 10, 15 years until the kids are adults and can go out on their own and earn their own way. That's it. And what they quickly learned was women who joined this program, started receiving these payments, were purposefully having more children and not marrying the fathers of their babies, because that meant larger paychecks. And all of a sudden, right, the bureaucrat, this is another, is so revealing what Murray writes about in his book. The bureaucrats, many of them were surprised. They were shocked at this. How could, this wasn't our purpose when we designed this program. And it shows just how little they know about human nature and how human beings respond to different incentives.
Surprised in the same way Pete Buttigieg was. I keep saying, I'm going to just call him Poot from now on.
Well, you can call him Putin. I mean, Putin was a communist, and Pete Buttigieg has a lot in common with communists.
As surprised as he was when he couldn't believe that Charlemagne the God didn't think that infrastructure was actually effective.
Right.
We are out of time, but I would be remiss if we didn't finish this with at least one other little topic, and I hope people will bear with us. I think this is an important conversation because this was where we ended last night's chapter meeting.
Yeah.
And it was really important because there always are those people who are going to push back and say, but Tom and Dave, you guys are saying stay out of all this and we shouldn't have NATO and we shouldn't have all these things. But look at what a country like China is doing right now. They're directly threatening the United States, and they're getting access and control over all of these precious minerals and everything else. And we have to do something about it. We can't just let China run wild. We can't just let Russia run wild. I'm going to make an argument, and that argument is that we believe in principle at the Vino Veritas Society. Mm-hmm. And if we believe in principle like we say we do, and we actually truly do, which I do, mm-hmm. I believe in what free markets eventually end up creating, and free markets end up creating the best possible solution. And I would argue that if you got rid of all the government regulation, if you got rid of all of the government oversight and the ways the government has gotten in the way,
you mean here in the United States,
right, of accessing the resources that are all over, whether they're precious minerals and rare earth materials, whether it's oil and gas mm-hmm. and fossil fuels and natural gas, manufacturing, all of those things. And you said, we're going to get rid of all of these regulations. We're going to get rid of all the tariffs. We're going to get rid of everything.
Yep.
And we are going to use our economic power, our ingenuity, our entrepreneurial talent that is so abundant in this country. And we started spreading that throughout the world. You let a guy like Elon Musk run wild to say, I'm going to go provide internet to the entire world through Starlink.
Yeah.
And cars and all of it, solar and all of these different things that people say they want.
Let creative people be creative.
So many countries in this world would become so dependent on the United States for the things that we produce that they would go and push back on their own. If part of that mutual exchange is, hey, we'll trade with you, we'll send these products to you, mm-hmm. but you also have to make sure you're not letting communist China come in and take over the world's supply of this. Because if they take over all the lithium, we can't keep providing you what we're providing you. Yep. You can't go make sure that Russia takes over Ukraine and takes control of the world's wheat supply, because then we can't give you the foods and the other things that we do well. If we let our economic opportunity, if we let our economic mm-hmm. creativity really grow, all of this becomes moot because the other countries around the world, and I think this is Cotavilla's point at the
mm-hmm.
end of the day in his essay, the rest of the world will stand up and defend themselves. The rest of the world will stand up and defend those who can't, and the United States won't have to be in endless wars all over the world, because every other country will say, we don't want that. And I go back to one of my best friends spent years working for Ralph Lauren in China. Mm-hmm. He lived in Shanghai working for Ralph Lauren. He worked for that company for over 17 years. And when he was there, I will tell you this, there's not a lot that will get 1 billion Chinese people to stand up to the Communist Party, but you start taking away American brands that they love, like Ralph Lauren. Yeah. You start taking away all those American brands from Chinese. Talk about something that will get Chinese people to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute.
Yep.
We want that. I want that product. I want these things.
I mean, you've put your finger on something. We should revisit this topic because it's so big and so important. You know, why is it so many countries are dependent on China, including us? Why is the United States, and not just, you know, manufactured rubber duckies and little things like that, important things like our supply of antibiotics.
Yes.
Much of it comes from Chinese factories. And that means if China just wanted to turn them off, say, no, we're not sending you any. Now, that would create all kinds of problems for China too, but it would be devastating. It'd be crippling for us. Why is that? Why do we Americans, do we not know how to make our own medicines? Do we not know how to make our own rubber duckies? Nope. Sure we do.
Yep. We
have so many regulations. The cost of regulatory compliance is so high that for many businesses, I want our listeners, as we wrap this up, get your mind around what this means. Many business owners find it less expensive to have something manufactured in China and then shipped here. That there's an enormous ocean in between.
Yeah.
You got to get it across the Pacific Ocean, either on a boat or on an airplane or something. That is more efficient than actually producing it right here in the United States. And there's only one reason for that, and that is the growth of the regulatory state, the burdens of regulatory compliance. So it's shameful.
So if we really want safety, if we really want a quality country and everything else, the solution isn't more military.
Yeah.
The solution is more economic freedom.
Yeah.
And the more economic freedom we have, and that is at its core, that is what the American idea is about. It's about freedom, and economic freedom is just as important as any other kind.
I hope our listeners, connect we were talking earlier about the struggles of just think of a young black person in a Democrat-controlled urban area, big city today in the United States, can't go start a business because of all the regulatory costs. That problem is directly connected to our own national security problems, right? Why have we become so dependent on China? Because of the same regulatory costs. Yep. And now we want to have an enormous army and a navy and all kinds of missiles and technology to protect ourselves from China, when the real answer is scale back the regulations so Americans can be productive and creative and free and not dependent on China or anyone else.
Right. Well, with that's what it means to guard the American idea, and that's what we have to keep doing every day.
Till next time, Dave. Nos sumos custodes.